"Now that your son is gone, you don't belong here anymore," my daughter-in-law said, standing in the doorway of the house I had called home for over 30 years. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked past her, into the living room where Daniel used to sit every Sunday afternoon, his long legs stretched out, a cup of black coffee in his hand, smiling at something on the television. 3 days. It had only been 3 days since we buried him. 3 days since I stood beside his casket, holding on to the last piece of my world, and somehow, that was all it took for everything else to disappear. Ashley didn't move aside to let me pass comfortably. She just stood there, arms crossed, her expression calm, almost bored, as if she were waiting for a delivery to be picked up. Maybe, in her mind, that was all I was. Something left behind. Something to be removed. I nodded once, more to myself than to her, and turned back toward the stairs. My suitcase was already packed. Not because I expected this, not exactly, but because something in the air had shifted the moment Daniel was gone. The silence in the house had changed. It wasn't grief. It was vacancy. I had folded my clothes carefully that morning, placing each item into the suitcase with the same precision I used when Daniel was a boy and I packed his bags for summer camp. Only this time, there was no return date. No excited phone call waiting at the end of it. Just quiet. When I came back downstairs, Ashley had stepped aside, finally. She didn't look at me. She was scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving lazily across the screen. I paused by the front door, my hand resting on the brass handle Daniel had installed himself 10 years ago. He said it made the house feel solid. I wondered what he would say now, seeing me stand there like a stranger. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. The walls held their memories, but they offered no defense. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. It was late October. The kind of day where the wind carries just enough bite to remind you that winter is coming. I didn't look back. I had learned something in those 3 days. Grief changes people. But it also reveals them. I walked down the driveway slowly, pulling the suitcase behind me. The wheels made a soft, steady sound against the concrete. It was the only sound that followed me. Ashley didn't call out. The door closed behind me without a word. And just like that, I was no longer part of that house. Not the kitchen where I cooked every Thanksgiving. Not the dining room where birthdays were celebrated. Not even the hallway where Daniel marked his height against the wall as a child. All of it, gone. Rewritten. I reached the sidewalk and stopped for a moment, adjusting my grip on the handle. Across the street, a neighbor's porch light flickered on, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. Life was continuing, exactly as it should. I took a breath, steady and quiet. They thought that was the end of my story. They thought I would disappear as easily as I had left. They were wrong. I did not go far that first night. There was a small motel just off Route 17, the kind of place with flickering neon lights and a front desk clerk who did not ask questions. I paid for a week in cash, sliding the bills across the counter with steady hands, as if this were something I had done many times before. The room smelled faintly of detergent and something older beneath it, but it was clean enough. A narrow bed, a wooden dresser, a chair by the window that looked out onto the parking lot. Temporary. That was the word that kept repeating in my mind. Temporary, even though I did not know what came next. I set my suitcase on the bed and opened it slowly, smoothing out the clothes I had folded so carefully just hours before. There was comfort in the routine. Order in a world that had suddenly lost all of it. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands for a long time. They looked older than I remembered. Thinner. The veins more visible beneath the skin. These were the same hands that had held Daniel when he was a baby, the same hands that had packed his lunches, buttoned his shirts, waved to him as he drove away to college. Now they were empty. The silence in the room. was different from the silence in the house. It was not filled with memories. It was just quiet. Plain and indifferent. I lay down eventually, still in my clothes, and watched the light from the parking lot seep through the thin curtains. Cars came and went. Doors opened and closed. Life moved forward for strangers I would never know. I did not cry. I thought I might, but the tears did not come. Instead, there was a heaviness in my chest, something solid and unmoving, like a stone that refused to break apart. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a moment, I forgot where I was. That brief second of confusion, where the world feels normal again. Then it all returned. The house. Ashley. The way the door had closed behind me. I sat up slowly and reached for my purse, pulling out the small envelope I had carried with me without fully thinking about it. It was addressed in Daniel's handwriting. I had found it weeks ago, tucked between documents in his study, back when he was still alive but already distant in a way I could not explain at the time. He had told me it was nothing important, just paperwork. I had believed him. I always believed him. Now, sitting in that quiet motel room, I turned the envelope over in my hands, tracing the familiar lines of his writing with my thumb. I had not opened it yet. Something had stopped me before. Fear, perhaps. Or the feeling that once I knew what was inside, there would be no going back. I placed it carefully on the nightstand and stood up, walking to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten, soft shades of gray turning into pale blue. Another day was starting, whether I was ready for it or not. I reached for the curtain and pulled it back just a little more, letting the light in. They had taken my home, my place at the table, my role in the life I had built. But they had not taken everything. Not yet. I stood there for a long moment, watching the morning settle into itself, until the sound of a truck engine pulling out of the parking lot broke the stillness. The world did not pause for anyone. It never had. I turned back toward the nightstand and looked at the envelope. Again. Daniel had always had neat handwriting, even as a child. Straight lines. Careful curves. He used to sit at the kitchen table doing his homework while I cooked dinner, asking me how to spell words he already knew, just to hear me say them out loud. I picked up the envelope slowly this time. It felt heavier than it should have, considering it was just paper. My name was written across the front. Not Mom. Not Mother. My full name. Margaret Collins. That alone made something tighten in my chest. Daniel only used my full name when he wanted me to take something seriously. I slid my finger under the edge and opened it with a quiet, deliberate motion. Inside was a folded document and a smaller note tucked neatly on top. I unfolded the note first. The paper was smooth, the ink slightly darker as if he had pressed the pen harder than usual. I could almost picture him writing it, sitting at his desk late at night, thinking things through the way he always did when something weighed on him. I read the first line, and the room seemed to grow even quieter. He had written that if I was reading this, it meant something had not gone the way he intended. That sentence alone told me more than anything else could have. Daniel had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to leave this behind. My eyes moved steadily across the page, each word settling into place with a clarity that felt almost cold. He wrote about responsibility, about trust, about making sure that the right people were protected when he could no longer do it himself. There was no anger in his words. No bitterness. Just precision. Careful, measured intent. I lowered the note slightly and let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. For the first time since I left the house, the weight in my chest shifted. Not gone, but different. I unfolded the document beneath the note. Legal language filled the page, dense and formal, the kind of writing that required attention to every line. I did not rush. I read it once, then again, slower the second time, making sure I understood what was being said. Names. Dates. Conditions. It was all there, laid out with a level of detail that left very little room for misunderstanding. Daniel had not been careless. He had not left things open to chance. He had made decisions. Final ones. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the papers resting in my hands, and stared at the far wall. The motel room had not changed. The same narrow bed, the same dresser, the same faint hum of the air conditioning unit in the background. But something inside me had. The confusion that had followed me out of that house was beginning to settle into something sharper. Clearer. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the envelope, smoothing it flat against the nightstand. Outside, the sun had risen fully now, casting a pale light across the parking lot. Another car pulled in. Another door opened. Life continuing, just as it always did. I reached for my coat and slipped it on, adjusting the collar with steady hands. There were still things I did not know. Still pieces of the story that had yet to fall into place. But I understood enough. Enough to know that the ending Ashley expected was not the one waiting for her. And for the first time since everything began, I allowed myself a small, quiet thought. I was not as alone as they believed. The air outside felt sharper than it had the day before, or maybe I was simply noticing it more. I stepped out of the motel room and closed the door behind me with a soft click, holding the envelope in my purse like it was something fragile, something that could shift everything if I let it. The parking lot was half empty, a few cars scattered under the pale morning light, their windshields catching the sun in quiet reflections. I walked slowly toward the small diner across the road, the kind of place Daniel used to take me to when he was younger, back when life still moved in simple, predictable ways. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, and for a moment, the smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread wrapped around me like something familiar. I chose a booth by the window and sat down, placing my purse carefully beside me. The waitress came over with a gentle smile, the kind that did not ask questions, just offered warmth where it could. I ordered coffee. Nothing else. I needed time more. Then I needed food. As I sat there, watching the quiet movement of the street outside, memories began to settle into place, not as scattered pieces, but as something more structured, more deliberate. Daniel had not always been distant. There had been a time when he called me every Sunday, when he asked for my opinion on everything from business decisions to what color to paint the hallway. That had changed slowly after Ashley came into his life. Not all at once. Never all at once. It was always small things. Missed calls. Shorter visits. Conversations that felt rushed, as if he were speaking from a place far away even when he sat right in front of me. I remembered the first time I noticed the shift clearly. It was at a family dinner, about 2 years ago. Ashley had insisted on hosting. Everything was perfect on the surface. The table was set beautifully, the food arranged with care, her smile polite and controlled. But there was a moment, just a small one, when I asked Daniel about a financial document that had come in the mail by mistake. Something about a transfer. He had hesitated before answering, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ashley, just for a second. It was subtle. Easy to miss. But I did not miss it. He had laughed it off, said it was nothing important, just routine paperwork. I had let it go. That was my mistake. The coffee arrived, and I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. I thought about the changes that followed. Ashley handling more of the finances. Ashley speaking for Daniel in conversations where he used to lead. Ashley gently redirecting plans, decisions, even small traditions that had once belonged to both of us. At the time, I told myself it was normal. That marriages shifted dynamics. That sons grew into their own lives. But sitting there now, with Daniel's words still echoing in my mind from the note, I could see the pattern more clearly. It had not been random. It had not been accidental. It had been built slowly, carefully, piece by piece, until I was no longer part of the structure at all. I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. Outside, a car passed by, its tires humming softly against the road. Everything looked ordinary. Peaceful, even. But beneath that surface, something had been rearranged in ways I had only just begun to understand. I set the cup down gently and looked out the window again, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. For years, I had believed that silence meant peace. That stepping back meant giving space. But now I understood something different. Silence can also be a strategy. And I had been silent for far too long. I stayed in that diner longer than I planned, not because I needed the coffee, but because I needed the quiet space to think without interruption. When I finally stepped back outside, the sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows across the pavement. The day was moving forward, and I knew I had to move with it. I walked back to the motel at a steady pace, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. Inside my purse, the envelope rested like a quiet certainty, something solid in the middle of everything that had been taken from me. Back in the room, I sat down at the small desk near the window and opened the envelope again, this time focusing on the details I had only skimmed before. There were names listed that I did not expect to see. A law firm I recognized from years ago, one Daniel had mentioned in passing when he was setting up his business. A clause that required all parties to be present for the official reading. Not just Ashley. Not just distant relatives. Everyone named. I read that line twice, letting the meaning settle. This was not something Ashley could control. Not entirely. I reached for the phone on the nightstand and dialed the number printed at the top of the document. It rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. I introduced myself clearly, giving my full name, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that carries recognition. The woman on the line confirmed that they had been trying to reach me. That the reading had been scheduled for the following week. That my presence was not only requested, but necessary. I thanked her and ended the call, placing the receiver back with careful precision. Necessary. The word lingered in my mind. For days, I had felt like something disposable. Something that could be removed without consequence. But this was different. This required me. I stood up and walked toward the mirror mounted on the wall beside the dresser. For a moment, I simply looked at my reflection. The same silver hair. The same lines etched into my face from years of living, of loving, of losing. But there was something else there now. Something steadier. I reached for my coat and smoothed the fabric along the sleeves, adjusting it as if preparing for something important. Because I was. I thought about Ashley, about the way she had stood in that doorway, so certain of her place, so confident that everything had already been decided. I wondered if she had read the same documents. If she believed she understood what was coming. Or if she had only seen what she wanted to see. I moved back to the bed and began to repack my suitcase, this time with more intention. Not just clothes, but the small details that matter when you step into a room where everything is about to change. I folded each item carefully, placing it in order, the same way I always had. Outside, the sound of passing cars continued, steady and unremarkable. The world did not know what was about to unfold, and it did not need to. This was not something for the outside world. This was something contained, precise, waiting for the right moment. When I finished, I closed the suitcase and set it upright beside the door. Then I returned to the desk and placed the envelope neatly in front of me. I rested my hand on top of it, feeling the slight texture of the paper beneath my palm. For the first time since I left that house, I was not reacting. I was preparing. And somewhere, beneath the quiet surface of it all, I could feel the balance shifting, slowly but surely, in a direction they had not expected. The days leading up to the reading passed with a kind of quiet precision that felt unfamiliar, yet necessary. I did not rush. I did not dwell. I followed a routine that kept my thoughts steady and my movements deliberate. Each morning, I woke before the sun fully rose, dressed carefully, and sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the light shift across the parking lot. It gave me time to think without interruption. Time to let everything settle into place. I reviewed the documents more than once, not because I doubted what I had read, but because I wanted to understand every detail, every condition, every line that Daniel had put into writing. There were things in those pages that I had overlooked before. Small clauses that carried more weight than they first appeared. Requirements that could not be ignored or bypassed. It was clear that Daniel had anticipated resistance. He had planned for it. That realization stayed with me. It changed the way I saw everything that had happened. Ashley's certainty. Her confidence. The way she had acted as though the outcome was already decided. It made sense now, in a different way. She believed she understood the situation. She believed she was in control. But belief is not the same as truth. On the third morning, I received a call from the law firm again. This time, the voice on the other end confirmed the exact time and location. A conference room downtown, a place I had been to once before years ago when Daniel first started discussing long-term planning. The woman spoke clearly, professionally, as if this were just another appointment in a long list of appointments. To her, it probably was. But to me, it was something else entirely. I thanked her and wrote down the details on a small notepad I had taken from the desk. The address looked familiar. Solid. Established. The kind of place where decisions were not made lightly. After the call, I stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting the information settle. Then I walked to my suitcase and opened it again, checking everything inside with careful attention. Not because I needed anything new, but because preparation had become a form of control. Something steady in a situation that had once felt unstable. I chose my clothes for that day with intention. Simple. Clean. Nothing that would draw attention, but nothing that would diminish my presence either. I wanted to walk into that room exactly as I was. No more. No less. That afternoon, I took a short walk down the road, letting the cool air clear my thoughts. The trees along the sidewalk had begun to change, their leaves turning shades of gold and red. It reminded me of other autumns, other years when life felt certain in ways it no longer did. But I did not linger there. I did not allow myself to fall back into what had been. The past had already shown me what it was. Now, I needed to focus on what was coming next. When I returned to the motel, I placed the envelope back on the desk, exactly where it had been before. I rested my hand on it briefly, not as a gesture of hesitation, but as a quiet acknowledgement. Everything that needed to be said had already been written. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. I sat down in the chair by the window and watched as the light began to fade once again. Evening settled in slowly, the sky dimming into soft shades of gray. Another day ending. Another step closer. There was no urgency in me now. No confusion. Just a steady awareness of what was ahead. They had believed that I would remain silent. That I would accept what had been done without question. But silence, I had learned, is not always surrender. Sometimes, it is simply waiting for the right moment to speak without saying a single word. The morning of the reading arrived without ceremony. No sudden realization. No dramatic shift. Just the quiet certainty that it was time. I woke before the alarm, the same way I had every day that week, but this time there was a different weight to the air. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Just present. I dressed slowly, choosing the outfit I had set aside the night before. A simple navy dress, pressed carefully, paired with the same coat I had worn when I left the house. There was something deliberate in that choice. A quiet reminder of where this had begun. I brushed my hair back, securing it neatly, and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. I did not search for strength. I simply acknowledged that it was already there. The drive into the city was steady and uneventful. Traffic moved in its usual rhythm, stoplights changing from red to green without urgency, people crossing streets with coffee cups in their hands, unaware of anything beyond their own routines. I followed the directions carefully, turning onto streets that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. When I arrived at the building, I parked in the structure across the street and sat in the car for a brief moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I did not hesitate. I simply allowed the moment to settle before stepping out. The building itself stood tall and understated, glass and steel reflecting the pale morning light. Inside, the lobby was quiet, polished floors echoing softly under my steps as I approached the reception desk. I gave my name, and the receptionist nodded with a recognition that was subtle but clear. She directed me to the elevator without unnecessary conversation. The ride up was smooth, the numbers lighting up one by one as the doors closed behind me. When they opened again, the hallway was calm, lined with closed doors and muted colors that carried a sense of order. I followed the signs until I reached the conference room. The door was already slightly open. I paused for just a second, then pushed it gently and stepped inside. Ashley was there. She was seated at the far end of the table, her posture composed, her expression controlled in the way I had come to recognize. She looked up as I entered, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps. Or something close to it. But it was gone quickly, replaced by the same calm confidence she had carried before. She did not greet me. She did not need to. Her presence spoke for itself. I took a seat across from her, placing my purse carefully beside me, my hands resting calmly on the table. The room filled gradually with others. A man in a tailored suit, likely the attorney, organizing documents with practiced efficiency. Another individual I recognized faintly from years ago, someone connected to Daniel's business. No one spoke much. There was a quiet understanding that this was not a place for casual conversation. Ashley shifted slightly in her chair, glancing toward the documents as they were arranged in front of the attorney. There was a sense of anticipation in her movements, subtle but unmistakable. She believed she knew how this would unfold. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her gaze returned again and again to the stack of papers on the table. I remained still. I did not mirror her anticipation. I did not engage in it. I simply waited. The attorney cleared his throat softly, signaling the beginning. Papers were aligned. Pens set aside. A quiet formality settled over the room. This was it. Not the end, but the moment everything would be revealed. I folded my hands gently and looked forward, my expression calm, my posture steady. Whatever came next had already been written. All that remained was for it to be read aloud. The attorney began with formalities, his voice measured and even, the kind that carried authority without needing to raise itself. Names were confirmed, identities acknowledged, and the document was placed squarely in front of him as if it held weight beyond paper and ink. I watched Ashley as he spoke. She leaned back slightly in her chair, one hand resting on the table, the other lightly tapping her finger against the polished surface in a slow, rhythmic motion. It was a small detail, but it told me everything. She was not nervous. She was waiting. Waiting for something she believed was already hers. The attorney turned the first page and began to read. The language was precise, structured in the way legal documents always are, each sentence building on the last with careful intention. He spoke of Daniel's estate, of assets, of properties, of accounts that had been accumulated over years of work and discipline. Ashley's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders straightening, her focus narrowing. This was the part she understood. The part she had been expecting. I remained still, my hands folded, my gaze steady. I had already read these words. I knew what was coming, even if she did not. The attorney continued, outlining distributions in a way that seemed, at first, conventional. Certain holdings allocated to specific entities, business interests maintained under structured oversight, trusts mentioned in passing but not yet explained in full. Ashley's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle tightening around her eyes now, a faint crease forming as she followed along. Something was not aligning with what she had anticipated. Then the attorney paused, just briefly, before turning to the next section. His tone did not change, but the room did. It was not something visible. It was a shift in presence, in expectation, in the quiet tension that had been building without acknowledgement. He read the clause slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. A primary residence, the house, the one Ashley had claimed so confidently, was not transferred in the way she believed. Instead, it had been placed under a protected designation, with conditions that required oversight and approval before any sale, transfer, or alteration could occur. And that oversight did not belong to her. It belonged to me. Ashley's hand stopped moving. The faint rhythm against the table ceased completely. Her eyes lifted from the document to the attorney, then to me, as if searching for confirmation that she had heard correctly. The attorney continued without pause, detailing the conditions further. Access, use, and any financial decisions tied to the property required my consent. Not suggested. Not optional. Required. There was no ambiguity in the wording. None at all. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer neutral. It carried weight now. Ashley shifted forward in her chair, her composure no longer as effortless as it had been moments before. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no words came. I did not move. I did not react. I simply sat there, listening, allowing the words to settle into the space between us. The attorney turned another page, continuing with additional provisions, each one reinforcing the same structure, the same intent. This had not been an oversight. It had not been a last-minute decision. It had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. I rested my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the present moment. Ashley glanced at the documents again, then back at me, her expression no longer controlled, but searching, uncertain. For the first time since I had walked into that room, she did not look certain of anything at all. The attorney's voice continued, steady and unwavering, as he moved through the final sections of the document, each line reinforcing what had already been made clear. The structure Daniel had put in place was not temporary. It was not something that could be easily challenged or adjusted. It was complete. Intentional. Final. Ashley shifted again, this time more noticeably, her posture no longer composed but rigid, as if she were trying to hold on to something that had already slipped beyond her reach. She finally spoke, her voice controlled but edged with something sharper beneath it, asking for clarification, asking if there had been some kind of mistake. The attorney did not hesitate. He answered calmly, referencing the exact clauses, the specific language Daniel had used, leaving no space for interpretation beyond what had been written. There was no mistake. Ashley's gaze moved quickly between the attorney and the documents in front of her, as if reading them again might change what they said. But words, once written with that level of precision, do not change. They remain exactly as they are. I remained silent, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture unchanged. There was nothing I needed to add. Nothing I needed to defend. Daniel had already done that for me. The realization settled into the room slowly, not with noise or confrontation, but with the quiet weight of truth. Ashley leaned back in her chair, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by something uncertain, something unsettled. She looked at me again, but this time her expression was different. Not dismissive. Not controlled. Searching. As if she were trying to understand how something she had believed so firmly could unravel so completely. I met her gaze without hesitation, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that did not need explanation. The attorney closed the document with a soft, final motion, signaling the end of the reading. Papers were gathered. Pens were set aside. The formality of the moment concluded without ceremony. But the outcome remained clear and unchangeable. I reached for my purse and stood slowly, the movement deliberate, measured. No one stopped me. No one spoke as I walked toward the door. Ashley remained seated, her hands resting on the table, her eyes fixed on the documents as if they might offer a different answer if she looked long enough. But they would not. I paused briefly at the doorway, not to say anything, not to make a statement, but simply to acknowledge the moment for what it was. Then I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me. The air felt different outside the room. Lighter. Not because anything had been restored, but because something had been set in its proper place. I walked toward the elevator with steady steps, my reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the walls. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby, watching as the numbers descended one by one. There was no rush in me. No urgency. Just a quiet understanding that what had been taken from me had not been lost after all. It had simply been waiting. When I reached the ground floor, I walked out into the open air, the city moving around me in its usual rhythm. Cars passed. People talked. Life continued, unchanged by what had just happened inside that building. I adjusted my coat and stepped forward, my path clear in a way it had not been days before. They had believed I would leave with nothing. They had believed I would disappear quietly, without question, without consequence. But they had been wrong about one thing from the very beginning. I had never truly left. Not the life I built. Not the place that was mine. I had only stepped aside long enough for the truth to be revealed.